Good evening, everyone. Everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. My name is Troy Smith. I'm a Habitat Program Manager with the department in the Yuma Regional Office. I'd like to welcome you tonight to this presentation. We're going to be presenting here live, and then also we are online as well on the web for tonight's educational seminar about wild burros in Arizona. We have a panel of 3 department experts who will be presenting information tonight on the history and ecology, legal history, proposed legislation, and resource and management issues of burros in Arizona. Our speakers tonight will be myself. I am as I mentioned before, I'm the Habitat Program Manager in the Yuma Regional Office. I have 12 years of professional wildlife experience, including a Bachelor of Wildlife Resources from the University of Idaho and a Master of Science in Forest Ecology from Oregon State University. Next will be Dave Conrad. He is the department's field supervisor of West Central Arizona. He's worked for the department for 25 years and has extensive experience in wildlife population survey techniques, bighorn sheep restoration, and all aspects of feral burro management. Dave has a Bachelor of Science degree in wildlife biology from Arizona State University. And then finally, Cody Carter. He is the department's liaison to the Bureau of Land Management. He has 15 years of experience in natural resource and land management and a Bachelor of Science degree in biology and a Master of Science degree in ecology from Northern Arizona University. After the presentation, we're going to open the floor up for questions, both to the audience and online. And for those of you watching online, you can submit your questions by email to webcast@azgfd.gov. And with that, we'll go ahead and begin our presentation. First off, a little bit of history, life history, ecology of wild equines, burros and horses. Horses and burros, they first appeared on the North American continent approximately 55 million years ago. But it wasn't until about 4 million years ago that they were species that we would recognize as being the modern equivalent of what we know today as wild horses and burros. Approximately 10,000 years ago, however, there was a massive megafaunal extinction in the North American continent that included the extinction of horses and burros as we know them. There are several other large mammals that disappeared from the continent as well. There are theories based on hunting from indigenous peoples as well as climatic change. Still up for debate and discussion. There was a 10,000-year gap, essentially, from when they went extinct to when Spaniards reintroduced them to the North American continent in the 16th century. So, because of the gap from when they went extinct 10,000 years ago until now, there's essentially this 10,000-year gap where burros were not present, yet the vegetative community continued to evolve on North America. And this also coincided with about 9,000 years ago to 4,000 years ago when the Sonoran Desert reformed into what we know today as the Sonoran Desert. The Sonoran Desert has gone through a series of cooling and warming trends, and about 10,000 years ago, it was transforming from a woodland community to the desert community that we now know. So a lot of these plant communities did not evolve in this last 10,000 years with wild horses and burros. And because of this reason and because of some other reasons, the National Academy of Sciences has actually presented a statement that wild horses and burros, they're not reoccupying an otherwise vacant niche. That is, it's not believed that they're reoccupying a niche that was vacated when they were extinct from the continent 10,000 years ago. The lifespan of wild horses and burros is approximately 10 to 15 years in the wild, 30 years or more in captivity. The rapid population growth is from about 11 to 23% in the literature. There are some studies that have it a little lower and some that have it higher, but we generally estimate it to be about 15 to 20%. And they also have no natural predators, which aids in this population growth. As you can see here, this is an example, a couple of examples that, and online you may not be able to see the pointer, but we have 2 lines here. The one in the red is a 20%, laser's not working, a 20% population growth, and the line in blue is an estimated 15% population growth, beginning with 100 animals. Within approximately 4 years at 15%, and 5 years at 15%, 4 years at 20%, the populations will double. So every 4 to 5 years under their recruitment, these populations will double in the wild. There are physiological and morphological differences between wild horses and burros and native ungulates. The first one, for example, is that native ungulates, they actually do not have any upper incisors. Bighorn sheep, deer do not have upper incisors. Wild horses and burros actually do have these upper incisors. They have elongated heads, and they have flexible mouth parts, which allows them to take advantage of vegetative resources that some of the native ungulate species cannot take advantage of. And the result of this can be damage to vegetation. They can consume woodier vegetation than some of the native species. They can consume vegetation closer to the ground. And their impacts can result in the delay of vegetation recovery on the landscape. And again, this is just an illustration here. This is some of the damage that horses and burros can do on the landscape. This is a Palo Verde tree here that has been extensively bark stripped, browsed, hedged, and this is damage that would not occur from native ungulates, but we see this evidence from wild horses and burros. A couple of more examples here of, you can see in the photo on the left here, extensive hedging, extensive browsing of not even the green vegetation, but also the woody vegetation parts, some bark stripping. Evidence also on the right there as well. Their digestive system is a little bit different also than the native ungulates. Native ungulates have a ruminant digestive system similar to cattle, whereas wild horses and burros actually have a cecal digestive system. Essentially, they get to the same point, but they have differences in their efficiency and the types of vegetation they can utilize. Essentially, cecal digestion is more rapid, but it's less efficient. And because of this, adult horses and burros, they can consume about 4.5 kilograms, which is over 10 pounds of forage per day. They are able to consume vegetation with lower nutritional quality than would native ungulates. That includes woody vegetation and vegetation that has a higher fiber content. And because it's more rapid, but it's less efficient than ruminant digestion, it's estimated that horses and burros actually consume about 20 to 65% more vegetation than an equal-sized ruminant would. And again, some of these grazing impacts that we identify are that they can consume woody vegetation and foliage that is not available to the native ungulates. And overall, what this does is it can reduce plant diversity, it can reduce plant abundance, and vigor, and also overall canopy cover above and beyond what we would see from the effects of native ungulates. These are some photos from essentially impacts from wild horses in Nevada, but I just wanted to show this to illustrate in some different ecosystems and grassland ecosystems, there's really a dramatic impact that can be seen from where areas were exposed from wild horses and burros to those areas where they were available for grazing. The result of this is impacts with, or excuse me, conflicts with native wildlife. First of all, folks sometimes will try and make the analogy between wild horses and burros and cattle. And really, they're two different beasts for several reasons. Because of their digestive system, because of the way they're managed. Livestock are managed more intensively generally. Burros have generally more of a passive management in the States. There really is not a big comparison there. They also have a broader habitat range that they can occupy. There is sufficient or significant dietary overlap between wild horses and burros and native wildlife, such as bighorn sheep and mule deer. And the impacts from burros and horses can be evident at springs, from trailing, wildlife waters, and some sensitive habitats that we'll discuss. First of all, for dietary overlap, there are studies that show significant dietary overlap between mule deer, bighorn sheep, and horses and burros. They'll all consume roughly the same amount of grasses, forbs, shrubs, depending on the time of year, depending on the season. And you can see here that bighorn sheep, they prefer green succulent grasses, forbs, and browse all year long. And that is essentially an overlap, not a direct not a complete overlap, but it is a substantial overlap between the diet composition of wild horses and burros. This competition is also with other species besides native ungulates, including with hares for vegetative species that they forage on, quail and birds and other wildlife species that utilize the canopy cover, the vegetation that burros forage on. There's a direct contrast there in burros' impacts and the ability to provide habitat for some of these native species. And the small mammal densities and species distribution can also be impacted by wild burros. The competition tends to be more pronounced when resources are limited, and it's believed and been studied that some of these impacts that are more evident when these resources are limited are actually exacerbated, in that it provides a competitive advantage to burros under these scenarios. There's also direct competition as far as physical competition, or at least physical interaction between burros and native ungulates. And some research has shown that where burros are present, the more burros are present, there's actually a negative correlation between burro presence and desert bighorn sheep. And this occurs at waterings. This occurs on the landscape scale as well, according to some research. And that although we don't know the mechanisms, we understand there's probably some part of the social interaction between the species. Burros can significantly impact wildlife waters. They can preclude native wildlife, native ungulates, from occupying waters. There's been research that has documented that essentially when burros are watering, that sheep and mule deer will not come in water at the same time. Some of these are the subtle interactions, maybe not necessarily direct aggressive interactions, but subtle interactions between the species. And they can also lead to extensive trailing damage, leading to and from water sources. This is an example here. Hopefully you can see the trailing, the extensive trailing leading to and from the spring here. Another difference between horses and burros and native ungulates are that they're essentially larger species. Native ungulates have smaller body size, smaller hooves, and so they tend to lead to less damage, less trailing activity than horses and burros. Some more research damage. Trailing by burros here is evident. This can lead to cultural resource damage. In Arizona, there are a lot of cultural resources, Native American sites that are on the surface of the landscape, and oftentimes burros can have trails that lead directly over these and cause significant damage. This is an example of trailing on an ash mound. It's a site where Native Americans cremated their dead, and burro trails can run right through the middle of these and other sites. There's also wallowing areas. These are areas where they'll spend extensive time wallowing in the soil, disturbing the soil. There's evidence that they can disturb soil as far as 30 centimeters into the, 30 centimeters into the soil, causing significant damage. And you can see this here, how the vegetation is there basically is no existing vegetation at this site from the activities from the wild horses and burros. And then I guess one of the biggest impacts that we see, or that game and fish we have concerns about, are the impacts to sensitive habitats. And a lot of the impacts that wild horses and burros can lead to on our landscape is in the most sensitive habitats, the riparian areas, that are valuable habitats for numerous other species. Some of these areas that we've seen significant impacts in the past include Havasu National Wildlife Refuge, Alamo Wildlife Area and State Park, and the Cibola and Imperial National Wildlife Refuges. And this is kind of an example of those areas that we're talking about, these areas that have perennial waters oftentimes, extensive native riparian vegetation, cottonwoods, willows, palo verdes, these species that are really important for a number of other species, including ungulates, birds, small mammals. again, just some of the small-scale evidence of impacts, and then some of the bark stripping, some of the utilization, some of the hedging that burros can cause on the native vegetation. And that the impacts that we're talking about on these riparian areas that can affect threatened and listed, or excuse me, listed species like threatened and endangered species, species of concern, sensitive species. All of these are of species of concern of one form or another, either federally listed, state listed, or part of habitat conservation plans. And all of these species can be impacted by changes in vegetation that horses and burros can influence on the landscape. And the bottom line then is with the potential impacts here is that horses and burros, they cause impacts even at low population levels. They are going to impact the vegetation, the flora, the landscape when they're at low population levels. But when they actually reach higher levels, that level of impact just increases and it's exacerbated. And that concludes my portion of just kind of the basic life history ecology of wild horses and burros. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Dave Conrad, who's going to talk about the legislation and some of the current management issues.
Can you hear me all right? Okay, I'll talk a little bit about our current situation and how we got here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the legislation that governs how burros are managed right now. And then I'll talk a little bit about the toolbox that's used to manage burro populations. And then we'll move on from there. The original law that governed, that was enacted to potentially protect horses and burros was in 1959. And it was initiated by Velma Johnston, who was also called Wild Horse Annie. And she did that through a letter writing campaign using school children nationwide. And that the first law basically only prohibited the use of motor vehicles and poisoning water holes as means to control horse and burro populations. So it was pretty limited. At the time, they thought that that would be all they needed for protection purposes. Prior to this law, though, wild horses and burros were managed by the states individually. So they were only covered by each state's maverick laws. In Arizona, that would have been Title III, which still covers maverick livestock in Arizona. And that just mandates that any unbranded, free-roaming livestock are to be captured by the state and sold at auction. That's the crux of Title III, dealing with maverick livestock in Arizona. The next law that came into place was the big one that we operate under now, and that was in 1971, the Wild Horse and Burro Act. So we're going to talk a little bit about the key provisions in that, the authorities that are in that, some of the important phrases in it, and the act and some of the amendments. There's been a couple amendments to it over the years. It's kind of interesting. There's a lot of language in the act that's open to interpretation. And so as you can imagine, there's been a lot of lawsuits over the years. I know I couldn't find a compilation of all the lawsuits to date, but I know that as of the early 1990s, there's been about 25 significant lawsuits involving the Wild Horse and Burro Act. And in most of those, the federal government was the defendant. And it was either cattlemen were suing the federal government or wildlife interests were suing the federal government, or horse and burro enthusiasts were suing the federal government. And all those entities were suing them because they either thought they were doing their job or weren't doing their job, basically. Basically, the act authorized the Secretaries of Interior and Agriculture to protect free-roaming horses and burros on public lands, basically. And we're talking about BLM lands and Forest Service lands, basically. Now, public lands has a very special connotation, in particular with the Wild Horse and Burro Act. Obviously, as I mentioned, it includes the top two categories, Bureau of Land Management lands and Forest Service lands, which are multiple use lands. There's a middle category that I call the maybe category, and it's a kind of a case-by-case category, and that involves National Park Service lands, military lands, and Corps of Engineers and reclamation lands. Each of those categories are kind of on a case-by-case basis. They may or may not be considered public lands in relation to the Wild Horse and Burro Act. It depends on their enabling language for that particular piece of land. Some of them have relinquished resource, or on some of those lands, those are withdrawn from BLM, say, and BLM may have relinquished resource management on those lands, and the Department of Defense manages resources. So it's kind of a mixed bag in that middle section. National Park Service, that might surprise some people, like that would include Lake Mead Recreation Area. There's a portion of that that is managed for a horse and burro area up around Lake Mead. The no category is pretty clear. These are lands that are not considered public lands in relation to the Wild Horse and Burro Act. And that would be the wildlife refuges, state lands, and private lands. Protection was extended to all unclaimed, unbranded equids on public lands for where they occurred at passage of the Act. That's a very important clause in there, where they occurred at passage of the Act. And so that was the extent of their range in 1971. And what BLM and the Forest Service were instructed to do soon after passage of the Act was to document on maps where do horses and burros occur as of 1971. That was their first step. They called those herd areas, and they mapped those out in public documents. The second step was to look at those herd areas where burros and horses occurred and look at a myriad of circumstances about where water was available, conflicts with nearby private lands, agriculture, conflicts with roads, things of that nature, and make a decision about, okay, where can we manage long-term for horses and burros? And that was a multi-year process. They were to try and achieve and maintain a thriving ecological balance with all the other multiple uses that take place on that land. They wanted to avoid non-public lands and conflicts there, like agricultural areas. And they wanted to avoid public safety conflicts on highways and roads. So a lot of that took many years to make those decisions about what areas within the herd areas would become the herd management areas. And I'm going to use those two commonly later on, HAs and HMAs. The next thing that they did for the HMAs, where they decided that they were going to manage long-term for horses and burros in that area, they had to decide what the appropriate population was going to be. And once again, this was a multi-year effort to decide this. In Arizona, a lot of that field work was contracted to Dr. Omart at Arizona State University. And he had a lot of grad students working on that for many years. And they gathered a lot of data about these burro herds, where they live, how much they eat, how many offspring they have per year, all sorts of parameters, to try and determine what the appropriate management level was, what the appropriate population for that herd management area was going to be. And it was really some high-quality work that they did. It was some good field science. They really worked hard at it, and they documented a lot of fundamental life history for these species. This is another clause that's in the Act. It directs the secretaries that they shall maintain a current inventory of burros. And to me, that means, you do periodic surveys. You do field work that will indicate what the population is, what the trends are they going up or down? And they use this to determine when populations exceed a thriving ecological balance, and it's based on the appropriate management level for that HMA. The Act also mandates that the federal agencies in charge will make these decisions in consultation with the state wildlife agencies. And they did that. When those AMLs were established many years ago, they consulted with the state wildlife agencies in setting those numbers. It also authorized an adoption program. Obviously, these species don't have essentially natural predation on them, so there's no limit on their population expansion. So some of them have to be removed from the range to keep them at appropriate management level periodically. And the Act authorized the secretaries to adopt those animals out if they were suitable. And it gave them the discretion to decide which animals were suitable for adoption and which people were qualified to adopt those animals. Lethal management. Lethal management of horses and burros is specifically authorized in the law, both on the range potentially to reduce populations or potentially to reduce unadoptable animals in holding facilities. Now, prior to 1984, the agencies used that pretty sparingly. Between 1984 and 2003, each year when Congress appropriated money to the agencies for their wild horse and burro budgets, they prohibited any lethal management actions. In other words, they put a clause in the budget bill saying that this money can't be used for lethal management at all. Now they stopped doing that as of 2004. So that is potentially an option that the federal agencies can use. The new Act does exempt the federal agencies and allow them to use motor vehicles. It allows them to use helicopters and trucks and whatnot to remove excess burros from the range or do other management actions. The Act mandates that horses and burros must be removed from private lands when requested. So when a private landowner has a problem, he calls up or writes in, they're obligated to remove those animals. It established a national advisory board, and there was an Arizonan on that for a long time, a man from Wickenburg, and I don't think he's on it anymore, and I don't think there's somebody from Arizona on that board now. And that's a national board. And it says, it has to be at least one veterinarian, I think, and it spreads them out amongst a geographical area. There's some caveats as to who can be on that. The other thing the existing Act prohibits translocation to public lands where they did not occur at passage of the Act. So the federal agencies can't transplant and be moving them around to areas where they didn't occur at passage of the Act. It prohibits that. Okay, we'll talk a little bit about the current management practices that are used to manage burros. Population estimation surveys, vegetation monitoring, of course capture and holding facilities, the adoption program, and the budget. We'll motor through a lot of this here because there's a lot of material. First we'll talk about the surveys because it's really foundational to everything. If you don't know how many are out there, you can't make intelligent management decisions. About 10 years ago, the department started working intensively with BLM in helping them conduct these surveys. We have a lot of expertise at Game and Fish Department in estimating animal populations. That's one of the core things that we do. So we help them out with this. This is the Lake Pleasant herd management area just nearby us here. The black line you see is the boundary of the herd management area. You can't see it very well, but there's a lot of small waypoints in there that are actual herd observations during the survey. And what we do is a double count survey where we spread these transects. We're using the helicopter, and we spread these transects over the whole herd management area. The technique we use is simultaneous double count. It's a robust mathematical technique for estimating populations. It's based on peer review research. We use a consistent protocol whenever we do these surveys. We develop sighting probabilities based on those protocols, and it yields a reliable population estimate over time. It's very mathematically robust. Vegetation monitoring. Some of what we do here is we've established transects for vegetation monitoring. And Troy showed you a couple pictures of Palo Verdes that had some severe bark stripping and branch breakage on them. We went in and we established transects for foothill Palo Verde by putting aluminum tags on them and giving each tree a serial number. And then we go in periodically and we read that tree. We determine, you know, how much utilization is on that tree, how many bird nests might be present in the tree, and we track that over time. And basically we're just monitoring. We're giving an annual checkup to each of these trees and looking at trends over time. We also do some riparian broadleaf bark stripping transects at the Alamo HMA. We do some riparian broadleaf seedling nipping transects at the Alamo HMA. And there's upland forage monitoring in the Black Mountains HMA west of Kingman. So these are other methods to monitor the effects of the burro population on vegetation. Of course, captures, pretty simple. You know, if there's excess burros determined above appropriate management level, they oftentimes herd them with helicopters into traps, into fence traps, and they use horseback wranglers also to rope them and get them into the traps. And then they also use corral trapping at water sites and bait sites. The horse and burro budget. As of fiscal year 09 is where these figures are from. In general, in the last 5 to 7 years, there's been a significant decrease in adoption demand. A lot of the people that wanted horses and burros have adopted them already. A lot of people, financial situations hitting them. You know, they're under financial stress, so they're not able to adopt them, or they have to give them up, even ones that they have adopted. There's a large unadoptable excess held in long-term holding facilities. These are oftentimes older animals, less desirable for adoptees. The total budget in 09 for the wild horse and burro program nationwide was $40 million. And of that, 70% or $29 million was spent maintaining these animals, unadoptable animals, in long-term holding facilities. So you can see the situation is severely hampering the active management end of things. They're having to spend a huge amount of their budget just maintaining these unadoptable excess animals in holding facilities, rather than going out and reducing overpopulations or doing surveys or doing any other kind of active management. This is a map that shows the herd areas and herd management areas in Arizona. The herd areas are green, and that basically just means that they were never designated as an HMA. They may in the future. Some of those have been designated to be zeroed out for all the animals that may remain there to be removed, that they're not compatible for long-term management. The pink ones are HMAs that have appropriate management levels established. And you can see up on top of the rim there's one Forest Service horse area by Heber, called the Heber Horse Territory. The other horse territory is the Surbat one up by Kingman in northwestern Arizona. Essentially all the rest are burro herd management areas or herd areas, although there are a significant number of horses in the Cibola trigo also, and the painted rock. We'll go through these one by one, just give you a thumbnail sketch of the status for each of these HAs and HMAs. This is a Tassi. It's up just north of Lake Mead on the Arizona Strip. It was never designated as an HMA. There's a Mojave Desert Tortoise recovery plan that's identified this HA to be zeroed out. Managing burros here was not compatible with this endangered tortoise, they felt, so they decided to zero it out. You can see the size of it. They're estimating there's maybe 10 left. That population estimate was off the website, so it might be a little bit old. The Black Mountain HMA. This is west of Kingman, between the Colorado River and Kingman. This is a really big HMA. It's managed by its own Black Mountain Ecosystem Plan from '96. You can see it's like over 1,700 square miles. The appropriate management level of burros determined here was 478. The population estimate was 715 as of 2007. And let me correct that. The current population estimate is 715. That was derived by increasing the estimate from '07 by 15% per year, which is what we use for an average increase. There's right now, I think as we speak, they're in the process of removing 100 burros from this HMA. The Surbat herd area that we spoke about this, it's not had an AML determined yet. The next management plan is going to address that. It may or may not become an HMA. And they're estimating that there's about 90 horses in there now. The Big Sandy, this is near Wickiup on the Big Sandy River. This is also a large one, 381 square miles. It has an appropriate management level of 139. The 2006 survey estimated 240 animals were present. At a 15% increase per year, that means now there's about 365. So you can see they're well above appropriate management level there. The Havasu HMA, that was just reassessed in the Lake Havasu Resource Management Plan from this year. They just finished that. The appropriate management level is 166 burros. They're estimating 61 in there now, and that's from the '06 survey. There's been some changes in this one in the RMP that they just inked. The old HMA used to cover this portion up here west of Highway 95. They removed that from the HMA, and they removed about 75 burros out of there within the last year or so. This is the Alamo Lake HMA. It's established through the Lake Havasu Resource Management Plan of this year. The appropriate management level is 160. In '06, we estimated 158. So with that 15% increase, that means we've got about 240 there now. You'll also notice that there's two areas depicted on this map. The pink area with the pink outline is the herd management area. The cross-hatched area to the east of it is where burros have spread outside the herd management area. These are two smaller ones here, relatively smaller, Little Harquahala and Harquahala HA. Neither one of these have been established formally as a HMA. They both have serious conflicts with private lands, with agriculture, some road conflicts and whatnot. So the decision made is to zero these out in the most recent plans. And you can also see that the Harquahala HA, which is on the right side, that has the green outline. The green outline is the original herd area, and the cross-hatched area is where the burros have spread outside the original herd area over the years. The last population estimate was in the Harquahala area was in 1999, and they estimated 50 then, And with that 15% increase per year, we're estimating 202 now. So we'll move on to the Painted Rock herd area. This is down by Gila Bend, west of Gila Bend, around Painted Rock Reservoir. This is mostly horses in here. There's some burros also. The latest plan here is from 1988, Lower Gila South RMP. The AML on this is currently at 0. There's too many conflicts. That whole valley at the northern part there is all agriculture, and there's a lot of agricultural conflicts there. And the current population estimate is 25 burros. Spola Trigo. This is down by Yuma, north of Yuma, northeast of Yuma. This is a big one also, 1,500 plus square miles. The AML in total is 315, 150 horses, 165 burros. The population estimate is from 2006, and it estimates a total number of animals at 428. And it's our understanding that they're going to remove 100 of these animals sometime in the next year. That's in their plan. Also, the newest RMP resource management plan is going to remove those disjunct pieces of the herd management area on the south that aren't connected to the main block. And the last one is the Lake Pleasant one that I showed the survey map from that Transect survey. It's actually, we're sitting inside the area of burro occupation at least. You can see the pink area is the herd management area. It's 161 square miles. It has appropriate management level of 208 burros. The population estimate, and we surveyed this just last year, so it's pretty fresh data. The population estimate was 396 for just the herd management area. And you can see this cross-hatched area is where burros have spread outside the herd management area. The population estimate didn't account for this area that they've spread out to. We only surveyed the herd management area within the pink boundary. I think that's the last slide on that one. I'll go ahead and turn this over to Cody Carter, our last presenter.
All right, how do you read? Good? Thank you. Grab my cheat sheet here. Try something different here. Oh, I can even hear myself now. Thank you. Tonight we've heard about burro ecology and management challenges, impacts to wildlife. My portion of the talk is going to focus on the Roam Act. It's an act that would modify or amend the original Wild Horse and Burro Act in a way that would greatly increase the impacts to wildlife. Well, the act, as Dave was talking about, when it was passed, it was believed that wild horses and burros were fast disappearing from the American scene. But now, 40 years later, it's pretty clear that under federal protection, they're flourishing. You know, populations doubling every 4 to 5 years, 20% growth rates, wildlife impacts as well. And I wanted to mention, we've been pretty burro-centric so far, but that's where most of our impacts to wildlife are. I want to mention the other half, the Wild Horse and Burro Act. because this is a nationwide program. It's funded by Congress through the BLM national office, and then the money goes, to the various BLM offices around the state. So any legislation that impacts us impacts the whole nation. And a dollar spent in Nevada, this is a picture of Nevada horses, is a dollar that's not spent in Arizona dealing with burro issues. Talk a bit about population control. Before 1971, the passage of the Act, local people were the major population control. And after 1971, the Bureau of Land Management became the only population control. And there's examples, throughout history, such as Yellowstone elk herd, deer herds on the Kaibab, North Kaibab, that, absent control, either natural predation or, human control, ungulates can grow beyond the habitat's ability to support them. So this is a population curve. You've seen this one before, but it makes a good point. It shows that the more animals you have, the faster the population grows, and the faster the population grows, the more animals you have, the bigger the impacts to wildlife. So I was recently at a conference on wild horse and burro management, and the keynote speaker was the deputy director of the Bureau of Land Management, and he talked about the wild horse and burro program ran by the BLM, and he gave a brief overview, and this is what I'm going to paraphrase of what he gave and information. 2001, 2007, there was a big push to get to AML. They got some money from Congress to get the populations down, and they made good progress. Got below AML in a lot of areas and removed a lot of wild horses and burros. Congress, seeing that this was all the successes, they considered it mission accomplished and cut funding. But meanwhile, reverse. This is still happening. Reproduction on the landscape still going on. And in 2 years, the population went from 27,000 nationwide up to 37,000. And adoption demand plummeted down to about 3,000 animals total, throughout the nation. The General Accounting Office, the GAO there, came out with a report that stated that the program was not sustainable. The Government Accountability Office is kind of the watchdog group, an arm of Congress that keeps an eye on making sure the agencies aren't misspending, tax dollars. And they said this is not sustainable. So then the former deputy director of the BLM went to the Wild Horse and Burro Advisory Board and recommended that we look at euthanasia. Wild horses and burros spark passion in a lot of people, so there was a big public outcry, and Congress listened. They became re-engaged, and they gave us the Rome Act of 2009. So Rome stands for Restore Our American Mustangs. Again, it's proposed legislation that would amend the original act, and those are the bill numbers. It's House Bill 1018, Senate Bill 1579, and we read this proposed legislation, and a lot of people really didn't think it would pass the House. It just had too many issues and did not seem reasonable at all. But we were wrong. July 2009, it actually passed the House, was sent to the Senate, and read twice in the Senate and referred to committee. And it's sitting in the committee right now. Could potentially be voted on at any time and then signed into law. So the take-home message I have written there in bold, underline, is that the Rome Act, if passed, would have serious negative consequences for native wildlife and wildlife habitat. Kind of a brief overview of what these consequences would be was that the Rome Act, if passed, got ahead of myself here, would expand the range of wild horses and burros, potentially to all areas of public lands. Not the herd management areas that Dave was showing you, all lands, all public lands. it would make controlling wild horses and burros much more difficult, and apparently it's pretty difficult as it is to control. And it would elevate the importance of wild horses and burros above other native species on public lands in these sanctuary areas they would create. So I'm going to go through in a kind of a stepwise fashion and look at all these potential wildlife conflicts in a little more detail. So in expanding the range of wild horses and burros to all public lands, the Rome Act, the original act restricted the range to distinct areas, and Rome, like I said, would remove this restriction. So basically the whole state could be, HMAs on public lands. And would spread the impacts to many other areas, sensitive riparian areas, quality, sheep, deer, habitat, and would increase the population and management costs that's in a program that's already chronically underfunded. So here's the current areas. You've seen this before, and under Rome, you can see they're all kind of clustered more to the western end of the state. Under Rome, this would be the herd management areas. Everything in yellow is public lands. It's a combination of both Forest Service and BLM. And it's not just the upland wildlife habitat areas here. It's our sensitive, or upland wildlife habitats. Sensitive riparian areas like in the southeast, San Pedro, Upper Verde, White Mountain streams, Tonto Creek, other buggy on rim streams. These are like the jewels of Arizona habitat. Could potentially be places with burros roaming and impacting. And another way to expand the range of wild horses and burros is that the Rome Act would allow BLM and the Forest Service to relocate wild horses and burros to public lands where they did not exist before the act. So not just letting them wander off into different areas, but they could actively move these animals to other areas. And that would have the impact of spreading the impacts around the state. And it could lead to transporting, problems that we see in our current HMAs, into other areas. And another way it would expand the impacts is that the Rome Act would require that the acres available, for wild and free roaming acts would never be less, shall never be less. When Congress says shall in the act, that's a must-do thing. Shall never be less than the acres available where they were found when the act was passed. And Dave was talking about resource conflicts, that some of the herd areas were zeroed out. So that would equal, at least 13 million acres. That's probably a conservative estimate. So if Rome is passed, there's an additional 13 million acres that would become managed for wild horses and burros. And another point is Rome would make controlling wild horse and burro populations much more difficult. It would require the BLM and Forest Service to exhaust all practicable options before capturing and removing wild horses and burros. And this could delay removal operations. And while you're busy exhausting all practicable options, the burros and horses are still out there reproducing, still doubling every 4 to 5 years. And that could lead to spiraling impacts because you move horses to different areas, you got more animals in more areas, all reproducing at exponential rates. And that could quickly get out of hand, especially with the sketchy funding, with vacillating with politics and with budgets, that could quickly spiral out of control and lead to great wildlife impacts. Another way that would make populations much more difficult to control would that Rome would require an adoption demand to exist prior to capturing animals. Well, we've already determined that the population or the adoption demand does not exist. We have 34,000 animals held in long-term holding facilities that no one wanted to adopt, and adoption rates have plummeted after that. So the demand is not there. It would lead to unsustainable populations, or another point is, under this new act, they would be allowed to transplant these animals to different areas, spreading the impacts, increasing the numbers of animals on the landscape. But while I'm here talking about adoptions, this is my opportunity to give a plug for the BLM Wild Horse and Burro program. If you're interested in adopting a wild horse or burro, you can call your local BLM office or go to www.blm.gov and learn more about adopting a wild horse or burro. And another sticking point that irks a lot of people is that Rome would require the identification of new rangelands or sanctuaries or exclusive use areas for wild horses and burros on public lands. This would be inconsistent with a multiple use concept of lands management and would reduce habitat available for wildlife. Well, a few months after Rome had passed, Secretary Salazar, Secretary of the Interior, who was kind of the main person in charge of wild horses and burros in the nation, came out with his own plan. It's kind of vague on the details, so I'll give you a basic overview of what we have. The plan would, one, designate wild horse and burros areas, preserves in the Midwest and the East, areas that are wetter with more productive grasslands, and relocate animals, from the arid West, from overpopulated areas back to these preserves, and would showcase certain herds on Western lands to promote adoption, apply new strategies to increase adoptions, and also to use population control measures to balance reproduction with adoption demand, which currently is about 3,000 animals. They would do that through the use of contraceptives. There are contraceptives out there that are good, can sterilize a male for up to, or a mare for up to 2 years. Management of sex ratios, basically removing more females from the population. Management of sex ratios is a powerful tool used by our wildlife managers and around the country to manage wildlife populations. And also sterilize certain herds, so for zero population growth. I don't think our commission or our department has come up with a position on this plan, if they support or not, but I think I could be safe to say that most of us would applaud any effort that would, one, reduce the number of wild horses and burros on the landscape and reduce the rate of population growth. I should say this is contingent upon congressional approval and funding, and it's going to cost some money. So the conclusion, kind of the take-home message here, is that Salazar has a plan, but meanwhile, Rome is still in the Senate and could be voted on and passed any time. And Rome would increase the intensity and scope of impacts to wildlife resources, increase the populations, the area occupied, and the impacts to wildlife resources. Game and Fish hasn't sat idle in the face of Rome. The commission sent a letter to the Senate opposing Rome. Our director, Larry Voiles, testified before Congress before the House had passed the Rome Act, opposing Rome. And personnel are currently working with WAFA, Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, to draft a collective letter in opposition to Rome. And our commission and employees are doing outreach to conservation partners and the public to educate about the impacts of Rome. And I think this brings me to the end of our collective presentations. I'd like to thank you all for coming out today and all of you for watching on the internet and listening to what we have to say. We're going to take some time, up to 30 minutes, to answer questions. In order for people out in cyberspace to hear us, I'll have to bring the mic around so to talk into the mic. So I'm going to kind of be the MC for the question part of this. You walk my mic over. There's a question. Oh, this thing's broken.
While we're waiting to do that, or give you a chance to get that working again, I'll answer these. Cody's going to take a minute there to get that mic working that dropped on the floor. We've gotten a couple questions that came in from our viewers on the webcast off the internet. And the first one is from Dale. And his question is hunting burros on state land an option? Can you do that already? And the answer to that is no, it's not an option. These animals are protected by federal law, regardless of where they occur right now. If they're not on public lands, then the federal agency is obligated to remove them theoretically, but hunting or lethal removal by citizens is not an option. And the second question I'll let Troy answer.
This question is from John. He asks, your presentation regarding habitat effects compared the burro to the cow. Neither species is native to this area. Why was the cow chosen as a comparator? And this is basically just an argument or a topic that people have brought up in the past, is that having burros and horses on the landscape is very similar to having livestock permittees that are permitted on the landscape as well. And I just wanted to illustrate the point that although some people have made that comparison, we really don't think it's a legitimate comparison because of the different management, basically the ecology of the species. Neither species is native, but also that livestock are typically managed in a much more intensive fashion. There are a certain number of animals that are permitted in areas, and they're more highly regulated. The burros basically are attempted to be maintained at an AML level, and aside from that, there really isn't a lot of active management that is done on the landscape. So I just wanted to draw that conclusion that really it's not an accurate comparison to compare livestock to wild horses and burros.
We're working now. Hear me?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, I'll paraphrase his question since our mobile mic's not working. His first question was, what's the current status of the horse territory in Heber? And my understanding is that they're working on the management plan that would set an appropriate management level for that horse territory, that it's not been set yet. And that management plan will dictate how many animals they can have there long term and what the management practices will be. So it's uncertain now exactly what that AML is going to be. The second question that the gentleman asked was about a number of burros that were illegally shot near Lake Pleasant last year and what the outcome of that investigation was. And those crimes, where people shoot burros like that are investigated by the Bureau of Land Management or Forest Service. It's not a law enforcement case that the state investigates at all, although we may assist them sometimes. And I've not heard an outcome on that. I don't think the people were apprehended, but I have not heard an outcome on that.
Well, Rome was introduced by Congressman Ray Hall, West Virginia, from the House. And there was a Senate companion bill that was identical. I read the two side by side, and it was introduced by Senator Byrd, West Virginia. And I'm not sure what groups, if any, spurred them to write this act, but it may have been any number of, wild horse and burro advocacy groups. As far as what the department would like to see with legislation, I think if the BLM were allowed to and had the funding to manage according to the act, that would be much better for us than status quo or especially the roam. Dave? Anything to add?
I just wanted to follow up on the question about who was supporting this, and I can't remember. Cody, did you identify the senators and representatives that were okay? The groups that have been identified, and there's a wide variety of groups that I think are supporting and opposing it, formally and informally. But a brief list here of some of the groups that are formally supporting it include Manes and Tails organizations, the Cloud Foundation, the Humane Society of the United States, the American Horse Defense Fund, and the Animal Welfare Institute. They're formally supporting this measure.
Already 30,000 animals being camped and taken care of. The problem is never going to fix itself with inadequate funding. We're just going to continue taking care of animals and putting them in captivity.
Yeah, personally, I would support Salazar's idea of moving excess animals from western ranges back east, and aggressive use of managing sex ratios and contraceptives. But I've never heard any strong message from our department, but we are very concerned about overpopulations of burros.
Yeah.
One of the problems with being stuck in a posture where you have to react to bad legislation is that if the legislation passes, you're in a bad position. If the legislation doesn't pass, you're still in a bad position. Given that it seems the professional wildlife organizations in the states that are affected by this population probably should have some definite ideas on how it can be better managed. Have you all considered putting together a proposed piece of legislation of your own to solve it better than what's being thrown at you from Washington?
That sounds like a good idea, but at my level, that wouldn't be what I would do. But
I'm Gary Hobart. I'm the deputy director of the department, and the department does regularly through our commission. We answer to the commission system. The commissioners appointed by the governor. Routinely look at both federal legislation options and state legislation options that can benefit wildlife and wildlands in Arizona. I guess what I would say is that right now, what is available is an alternative that, if properly funded, would allow under the existing legislation or the existing law would allow herd management areas to be managed to AMLs, to the levels that were established for those areas, would establish adequate funding for additional facilities for humane warehousing, for want of a better term, of excess animals that are either unadoptable or for which there is no demand. Put them in a humane location. It would also potentially fund for the ability to significantly increase or take a much more aggressive approach to sterilization or contraception for these animals. And you have to get effective, to have contraception be effective for wild populations, you have to get very high numbers of contraception to really make it effective over time. So I would submit one solution would be adequate funding of the existing law that has established herd levels that have been agreed to by almost all the management organizations, would establish target numbers, locations, and an alternative for those animals that are excess population, an alternative other than euthanization or lethal removal.
Yes.
Would it be possible for the state legislation to request the BLM to remove them from the state trust
The question was whether or not it was possible for the state to request BLM remove animals from state trust lands.
Yeah, the current law mandates that the federal agencies remove burros where they occur outside public lands. So state lands would not be considered public lands. They would be in the same category as private lands, essentially. The problem has been the budget. You know, there's a lot of instances where these burros occur outside public lands or outside the designated HMA on public lands, and the agencies haven't been fully funded to execute those plans, you know, to remove those animals as needed. So oftentimes, as usual, it comes down to money.
The money to manage the wild horses and burros? Yeah, that's federal money.
Well, we have done that on a limited basis. We've come up with independent money. Game and Fish and Arizona Department of Transportation pooled money together to remove burros in that part of the Havasu HMA that had been removed from the HMA. ADOT got involved because there were significant highway concerns with car collisions with burros there. And we got involved because of the serious impacts to wildlife and wildlife habitat. So we did, but money's tight. You know, we're tight on money too, and it really chaps some people to use wildlife money to manage burros, you know, even though that might be a good decision.
Could you repeat the last part of the question again?
If the BLM or whoever would pay a fee to the Arizona State Trust Land to allow horses and burros to roam on state trust land as part of their.
Well, you know, potentially that would be a solution, but I got to believe that the current livestock operator would have something to say about that, who has the allotment from the state land department. Because, you know, there's only so many animals you can run on the range, and every burro that they paid to have run there was going to be one or more less cows that he'd be able to run on the range.
I would say too, you know, the wildlife, native wildlife, resident wildlife in the states are the responsibility and the property. They belong to the citizens of the state. Arizona Game and Fish manages in trust for the citizens of Arizona the native resident wildlife in the state. Wildlife have a tough enough time as it is. We have, while the option you talk about or thrown out for discussion, I think is useful to highlight some points of difficulty. I think what we would say is that we don't have any interest in this department in trying to expand the current challenge of unmanaged, essentially relatively unmanaged populations of this rapidly growing population of animals into other areas where they're going to impact already native wildlife. We see no need, no reason. Quite frankly, we see many, many reasons to not want to help expand the impact of these animals on native wildlife species. I studied the wild horse or the wild burro herd in Bandelier National Monument back in the 70s as a part of one of the OMARC guys. We were slave labor. We didn't know it. We thought we were having fun. We enjoyed it. It was an interesting place to work. I have a lot of respect for wild burros. They're many ways remarkable animal. They do not belong everywhere. They are not a native species to this country, to this area. And wildlife species do need every break they can get. So we are not interested in proposals that would expand the burro and wild horse population impacts to other areas where they currently don't exist.
Population-wise, you're apparently speaking just of the burros tonight, but what is the total population of burros in Arizona, and what is the total population of the Mustangs? And how much are the Mustangs impacted?
Well, I'd have to total all those up. I don't know the total burro population right off the top of my head. It's, you know, probably, well, maybe 2,500 in that ballpark for Arizona. But it appears that the number of horses is under 500. So it's a percentage, a relatively small percentage of the total. Not yet.
This may just be semantics, but I'd like a clarification. Keep talking about wild horses and wild burros. Should we be talking about feral horses and feral burros?
The question was whether or not referring to wild horses and wild burros is appropriate as opposed to feral horses and feral burros. And that may be a more realistic terminology for them. However, in the federal legislation, they are referred to as wild, free-roaming horses and burros. And we do not consider them. They're not native wildlife, and because of that, that is one of the reasons, or one of the many reasons why they are not managed as native wildlife by the Arizona Game and Fish Department. The department does have management impact in that we coordinate with Bureau of Land Management and other agencies to try and maintain these populations at AML and try and assess the habitat impacts that are occurring and try and encourage the management of these burrows at appropriate management levels.
Currently, the only management option is chapter.
Currently, that is the management option that is being utilized. Theoretically, I think there are some options that are identified in the Act, such as euthanasia, but those are not being implemented at this point in time, and so right now that is probably the main opportunity. I think so. Someone here had a question up.
Well, the problem, from what I understand with the contraception, is it's very, very expensive, and then it costs more money to monitor, and it's been tried out over the past how many years, but it's very expensive, and we have the money cost. So even if you're, the wild horses have been all over the news, and unfortunately, nobody has enough money to hire celebrities to back them against what's out there. But what all the animal activist groups are claiming that contraception deviates from the genetic viability of the herd. So they're not for that at all. They're just wanting more land to spread that around.
The question essentially was questioning the viability and the expense and the realistic ability to implement sterilization.
The sensationalism that's been going around now is against contraception because it changes the genetic viability.
I don't know if Gary, you want to take this, but I guess my initial response to that is that it may be a tool that can be used that may aid in managing wild horses and burros. It's not going to be the panacea. It's not going to be the end all. And there may be certainly there are some pros and cons to it, but it isn't going to be the solution. I think it's going to be it could be part of the solution, but it won't be the solution.
Don't you see the problem? Don't you think the problem is managing the public?
Sorry?
Okay. Yes. Well, I guess what we can speak for our agency, and I would not want to try and put words into the mouth of people who I think probably for a wide range of reasons have very strong feelings on both sides of the issue. And I think I need to let those organizations, those individuals, speak for themselves. I think we in the department, our position is this: there is an existing law that if fully funded, adequately funded, is probably adequate for us to be able to sustain this non-native population of animals in lands in the western United States and sustain a viable, the best possible viable future for the native species with whom those animals are in significant conflict and competition with if they are not appropriately managed. There is admittedly a lot of emotion around this issue again on both sides, but rather than try to explain it, I think we in the department pretty much let those words and those acts of the folks that have strong feelings about this speak for themselves. Our position we've tried to make fairly or clear and consistent. We manage for resident native species of wildlife in the state. We also are very deeply involved in managing for threatened and endangered species, which, as the name implies, already have a very tough road ahead of them as we try to help recover those populations in Arizona. Do these animals, I think the federal law has taken this out of the state's hands as having states be effective managers of these species. An adequately funded current law is probably the single most immediately viable option that exists. As it is right now, it's funded the way it is. This is becoming a growing problem. I think to some extent, Rome is to some extent kind of throwing hands up in the air and deciding that the solution to adequate funding of the existing law is to expand the impact of these animals to other native wildlife populations throughout the United States. Funding would allow BLM to manage to the AMLs, the management levels within the herd management areas, manage under the existing law to manage for where other impacts on public lands are seen to have taking priority over maintaining wild horse and burro populations in those areas, and would allow for adequate areas, yards where these animals, excess animals, could be maintained in a humane way. Those options exist right now. Those options, if followed, would in fact have the effect of, you could end up with the same number of animals. Although I don't want to speculate on what the in advance of what the current practices that are funded and that the Bureau uses. There are other options that are available to them. They have not been funded or resourced for them to use. That is for the Bureau to decide whether that option is, those options like euthanization and lethal removal are options they want to pursue. I would also say it is your ability to influence that by letting your elected representatives know how you want these animals managed. They're being managed in your name. And I will let the agency responsible for managing that program speak for itself on that, which isn't us.
I have a couple of questions from cyberspace. One from Sarah. What can we, the public, do to support the opposition to Rome? And I think my best answer to that is the department has written letters to the Senate, and we've gone out and educated, our publics, the people we know about the impacts of Rome. So that would be my best suggestion. Question from Don. As far as I know, no one else has co-sponsored or signed on to the Rome bill that Senator Byrd introduced in the Senate. Do you really believe that the Rome bill could pass the Senate? I really hope it doesn't, but I did not believe it would pass the House, and it did. So that makes me scared, and that makes me write my congressman.
We have a couple more questions from cyberspace. This one is from Gene, and it asks if we can identify any specific native species that are currently in danger of extinction due to burros and horses. And I guess I would say essentially that there are numerous species that are impacted by wild burros. In particular, one species that I can name off the top of my head would be the southwestern willow flycatcher. And there have been biological opinions that have identified monitoring measures, et cetera, in order to assess the impacts that wild burros are contributing to the potential habitat decline. And there are numerous other species that currently maybe not be listed, but could be impacted and are impacted due to these habitat impacts, including the Sonoran desert tortoise, other riparian species like the yellow-billed cuckoos, bat species, et cetera. So burros can be a contributing factor, but to make that direct link, probably not in so many instances, but like I said, with southwestern willow flycatcher, there have actually been direct links in certain areas in which those impacts need to be monitored.
We had another question from Karen from one of our web viewers. The question is, burros of oatmen must have a much higher reproductive rate than other burro populations. And she's talking about Oatman, Arizona, in the Black Mountains. It'd be in the Black Mountain HMA west of Kingman. Are they counted in the Black Mountains population and managed in the same way? Generally speaking, yes, they would be part of the HMA, although there is a caveat to that because there's significant parcels of private land that make up the town of Oatman, probably a number of patented mining claims. So the people that own those lands, if they requested the burros be removed, then the federal government would be obligated to remove them. And I suspect that the Bureau has done nuisance animal removal specific to the city of Oatman in the past. And so they would address it at that point. But yeah, they, generally speaking, they are part of that HMA and part of the total.
We probably have time for probably two or three more questions at the most here.
From a hunter's standpoint, would the department be interested in investigating like habitat stamp, like 12-day timeout stamp? Would you need to purchase for 20 weeks, 22, 60 days, and have to go towards that funding? Would the department consider something like that?
All right.
Yeah, there's a reason why I hung around for that. Besides, we went over, everybody who came here early learned what a Gambel's quail sounds like. So if you missed that, talk to me after the meeting. I guess what I would say to that is it's hard to evaluate a proposal that's new to us on the floor of an event like this. But what I would submit is we have go to our website. And if you'd care to flesh that out or line that out, launch that to us and get it so that we can put that into our process and take a look at it. I think my initial reaction would simply be that sportsmen's dollars are very precious to us. We receive no tax funding. We're a user pay, user play type organization, and our sports, if you see wildlife around the state, native wildlife, and you've enjoyed them, you probably ought to think about thanking a hunter, fisherman, or a gambler, as we get, heritage money. And I would submit that the need for those dollars in these economic times and revenue drops, I think if we were going to look to the sportsmen and women of this state for additional funding, we would prefer to see it go towards improving opportunities for resident native wildlife species. However, having said that, we're always, every year this state, every year the Western United States changes. It develops, it grows, and new ideas and new solutions are always something we're open to. So I would invite you to go to the website, or you can get my card after this and launch an email directly to me and kind of outline that so that we could take a look at it.
Any more questions? Could you repeat the question? I couldn't hear you. Are you referring to the question was about 33 animals in the state, and were you referring to those? Pardon me? Yeah, 33,000. Were you referring to those animals that were in the long-term holding facilities?
I'm not sure exactly where all those holding areas are, but all those animals in the holding areas are sterilized. So when they remove animals from the range, they sterilize them. I know some in the Midwest, and they're talking about setting up more of them in the Midwest and East, where it's more productive.
I would just, according to the director of the Bureau of Land Management 5 days ago, he says a number of Mustangs, wild horses, is about 33,100 in the wild, and then an additional 30,000 plus are in holding facilities. Pardon? Correct, although I do not know about, I quite frankly am not familiar with what wild horse populations might exist east of the Mississippi River. Yeah, I think that there's not much of a although we're happy to share our wild horses and burros with our friends in West Virginia and Tennessee and those areas. I'm told Kentucky is great for horses.
All right, we have one more question. Somebody, yes.
Yeah, I'm familiar with those. There was an illegal shooting incident on them 4 or 5 years ago. Those are the burros that are just northwest of Williams on the Kaibab Forest. My understanding is that that's not a formal herd area or herd management area. It didn't show up on any of our research at all, and it's not one that we're familiar with at all, although I have heard of those. Yeah, oftentimes trapping is difficult. It's not very effective, oftentimes. Yeah, we'll investigate that some. There's also another question about some burrows that occur north of Saguaro Lake that didn't show up in our research at all as a herd area, herd management area. So, and I can tell you from personal experience, a group of 5 burrows have showed up in the White Tank Mountains within the last year. And I know, I'm almost positive there were never any there prior to that. And we suspect that it may be people that adopted burros that, came on financially hard times and may have let them go out there, possibly. That's a possible explanation.
So one more hand up over here, and this will be our last question. Does that person still have a question? Yeah, that'll be the last one, and we'll call it good.
I would suggest that West Virginia has no wild horses or burros, but if their congressman can put together something so comprehensive that has grown from their perspective in the East Coast, why can't we in our state, whether the Game and Fish does it, most of us here are not organized to do it, why can't we get our congressman to propose something that will really work? And I don't just mean fund existing legislation. I mean some brainchild that will really work over the long term. Why can't we do that with our senators and congressmen? Why hasn't that been attempted in a broader sense, in a more comprehensive sense?
I can't speak as to why it hasn't happened per se. I guess I would refer back to what Gary, our deputy director here, mentioned earlier, is that we're always looking for new approaches to solve these problems and initiative on how we can reach solutions to these issues. And maybe it's something like that that the department would need to approach and to consider. But to this point in time, you know, I don't know why that hasn't happened yet, and maybe it's something we'll consider and judge it on its merits.
I know we're going to close now. I guess I would just say that, you know, as a state agency, we do routinely work with the state congressional legislation or state congressional delegation on a variety of legislative issues. I would say that there is a certain delicacy to a government agency, even at the state level, becoming a lobbying institution as opposed to an institution that answers questions and points out challenges. And does propose solutions. We are not an agency that believes you can just throw a problem out there and then let somebody else come up with a solution. We believe in providing some alternatives. I think what I would like to say is that you as citizens, remember the Congress of the United States are your employees. You have I retired after 30 years in the infantry to come back to Arizona and work. So I've been one of your employees myself for 30 years. I would tell you, you've sent me to some very, very interesting places. I did not want to go. So you've got a lot of power. Well, at least over me you did. I would submit to you, though, that you should. There's plenty of information on the web about where you can go for those of you who are Arizona residents to let your feelings be known, your ideas, your thoughts on this issue. If you are visitors and are residents in other states, you can find your congressional delegation easily online at any number of sites. And I think if you believe in wildlife, as you walk the rivers of Arizona and you see river otters and you see the birds and you see the other animals and native wildlife that has made Arizona such a loved place, you know, contemplate the impact of these animals on those places you love, and let the people that do have the responsibility for, since they took ownership at the federal level in 1971 over the issue, let those people know what you think and what you believe about the solutions to this problem. We will continue to work with our delegation. They are one delegation. So we really appreciate the turnout. I don't know how many folks we had online. This is a great turnout tonight. We will continue to increase the number of these. You can go online and see this presentation, or invite your friends to view it if they weren't able to participate. If you go online, you will find the presentations we've done on lion biology, desert bighorn sheep biology, and those will soon be joined by other things. So we invite you to come back. I know some of you are our guests over here in the RV park, so we appreciate having you have this opportunity, but really appreciate you being here. I hope you all drive safe, get home safe, and keep Arizona Game and Fish in mind when you think about wildlife. Thank you.
What's your notes? Did you give this again? Should we shred them or something?
What's that?
Should we shred them?
I don't know if they do it.
Part of the administrative record, I guess. Yes.
I've caught burros upon as many as 50 over the last year and a half. You know, I'm gonna come get them on private property.
So you
And they've even threatened me to the point that we'll come arrest you for holding them.